Well, Mozambique has been a major recipient of budget support over the last 8 years, receiving somewhere of the order of $450 million per year from 19 different development partners. And it's been obviously an important program for the government, comprising somewhere between 18 and 10% of public spending. And we found that for the most part these resources had been well used, in particular used for improving spending on education, where there's been a fundamental change in the coverage of the education services, with 60% more children in secondary school at the end of the period and 40% more children in primary school. And in the case of primary schooling, we're now close to gender parity, not yet in secondary, but there's been good results overall. And the other point about the education expansion is that it's been predominantly to the favor of the poor. So it's been well balanced as well in a sense of equity. From other perspectives, this has been a period of good macroeconomic growth and stability, and budget support's contributed to that. It's been a process of fast reform in PFM systems, public finance management systems, and there's also been significant improvements in governance. At the beginning of the period, there was no agency dealing with corruption. There is now an agency for combating corruption, which in 2012 prosecuted 88 cases. And there is also legislation on corruption. There's some concerns about how effectively the anti-corruption agency works, but it at least is operating and it has a structure, which was not the case 7 years ago. So overall, the findings are positive. On the other hand, this has been a period where there has not been any reduction in poverty, in particular in income poverty. So whilst there's been improvements in access to social services, in particular education, income poverty has essentially remained at the same level. And we still have somewhere over 50% of the population of Mozambique living in poverty. And there we see the key challenge for the future, to find ways of improving public policy, improving public spending in order to make a bigger impact in those areas. A key aspect of the problem about addressing poverty relates to the agriculture sector. Something like 70% of the Mozambican population live in rural areas, and of course many of these rely directly or indirectly on agricultural income. And of the small and medium-scale farmers in Mozambique, only about 4% are using fertilizer and improved seeds. And as a result, their productivity is very low, and very low in comparison with neighboring countries. Those farmers that do use fertilizer get productivity gains between 4 and 7 times those that do not use it. So if there would be some way of improving the access of small farmers, in particular to fertilizer, but also to seeds and pesticides, then that could make a dramatic difference to poverty. Of course, this isn't a straightforward problem, because access to fertilizer usually requires access to credit, and creating access to credit in a sustainable way is not always simple. But the problem seems to be one that was not properly addressed, and it's a major gap in the dialogue process, which we think needs to be addressed much better in the future. Well, in terms of challenges, I think it's important to contextualize this a little bit. We should remember that Mozambique emerged from over 30 years of civil war in 1992. And now that might seem a long time ago, but the legacy of a civil war of that kind is a long legacy. And we can see that in the constraints that Mozambique has in terms of its human resource capacities and in terms of its service delivery infrastructure, which has still not been fully built up. So there is an underlying constraint which all aid has to address, and which is a challenge for budget support. There's also 2 more particular challenges. One is to do with finding policies in the areas that can make a difference for income poverty, so especially agriculture, but also the overall climate for doing business and the extent to which employment creation can be made an easier process in Mozambique. And there is also a long-standing problem of malnutrition, which has not been properly addressed and was not properly addressed during the evaluation period. And then on top of that, there's another contextual factor, which is that despite the fact that we have seen gains in Mozambique, and despite the fact that budget support has been fundamentally successful, there is some skepticism about its use amongst the development agencies providing budget support. And so long as there is a skepticism, there is a lack of sufficient engagement with the process and a lack of sufficient investment. And solving these policy problems requires the development agencies to invest in research, in analysis of options, in dialogue with government, and to engage much more wholeheartedly than they have done in the past. Well, to make budget support more effective in the future, we need to address those challenges very squarely. Obviously, the problem of constraints in human resources is not something that can be easily solved. So there needs to be an awareness of that. But issues related to policy can be solved. There are countries in Africa that have much higher usage of fertilizer and improved seeds. Neighboring countries such as Malawi and Zambia achieve much higher levels of usage of these inputs. So there are systems that have been applied in other countries which can be tested in Mozambique and could make progress. Addressing the problem of malnutrition is another one, and addressing the problem of the business climate is another. And all of this requires a concerted effort by the development agencies to work closely with the Mozambican government in a collaborative spirit. We are confident that those areas are areas of shared interest. In other words, that the government very much wants to make improvement in those areas and would welcome a partnership focused on increasing spending through the budget on those areas. But it's a question of making sure that the focus is on that and not focusing quite so much on the areas where progress isn't being made. We would like to see anti-corruption efforts being more successful. We would like to see public finance management improving faster. But so long as it is improving, I think that should be enough, and the focus needs to be on other areas. I mean, what we've recommended is really 4 things. I mean, just as a first step, there does need to be a reinvestment in the budget support process. In other words, some agencies may choose, for legitimate reasons, to stop providing budget support, and if so, they should make that decision now. Those agencies that remain need to recognize that this is an instrument that can help them and help the government of Mozambique to scale up spending in areas that it can make a difference to poverty. But for that to happen, they need to invest wholeheartedly in the process. That's the first issue. And that requires some communication with headquarters and with political masters. The second issue is about making the dialogue more fluid. At the central level, it's become a little bit heavy. High transaction costs, too many committees. It needs to be lightened up and streamlined. And at the sectoral level, in particular in areas such as agriculture, it needs to be made much more active and much more evidence-based. So there is a need to find ways of taking dialogue down into the sectors which are strategic and are important for poverty reduction. And then we also recommend, in terms of the areas that have made progress, so education, macroeconomic management, public finance management, good governance, to consolidate and deepen those gains, and then to find ways of expanding public spending in those areas where there hasn't been enough spending in the past. So actions which combine public policy reforms and public spending to tackle the problem of productivity in agriculture, the problem of the business climate, and the problem of malnutrition.